Hello everyone. I am Annika Snap from the International Space Science Institute in Bern. And it is my great pleasure to welcome today Corinne Le Quéré for a very interesting seminar on the global carbon cycle. So I will briefly introduce Corinne. Let me start by saying that Corinne is one of the most renowned experts in the world on the global carbon cycle and its interaction with the Earth's climate. Corinne is currently professor of climate change science at the University of East Anglia in the UK. She has also a position of professor extraordinaire at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, France. Between 2011 and 2018, she was director of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research in the UK. Corinne research is devoted to study the carbon cycle in the Earth system at a broad variety of timescale. And among others, she has shown that climate change and variability strongly affects the capacity of the Earth's carbon reservoirs, like the ocean, vegetation, etc., to absorb carbon dioxide emitted by human activities. About 13 years ago, Corinne initiated the yearly assessment of the global carbon budget in the context of the Global Carbon Project. And such an initiative has strongly influenced both climate research and climate policy worldwide. Corinne has contributed to, I think, 4 IPCC reports. She is currently chair of the French Haut Conseil pour le Climat, and she is a member of the UK Committee on Climate Change. Obviously, her work is highly cited, and I think the amount of citation is exceed 22,000. Sorry. She received many prestigious awards, among others the Grande Médaille Albert Ier de Monaco, the European Copernicus Medal, and recently the Heineken Prize for Environmental Science, and many others. I will not quote all of them. In 2016, Corinne was elected fellow of or member of the Royal Society in the UK, and in 2019, she was appointed commander of the Order of the British Empire for service to climate change science. So I will stop here, and Corinne, the floor is yours now, and we are pleased to listen to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Annie. Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here and to have the chance to give this presentation about my work about the carbon cycle and carbon emissions. I particularly appreciate the fact that we can do this virtually, therefore at no emissions cost, and with an audience that is very diverse, like the one that I know is here, including people that I know very well and people that I'm sure will be less familiar with the carbon cycle. I'm going to start sharing a presentation here. You can put me side by side. Probably most of you are familiar with Zoom at this point. If you just give me a moment to upload everything correctly. Voila, you should now see my presentation full screen. Annie, would you kindly confirm, please?
Yes, absolutely. Perfect.
Thank you very much. So because I know of the diverse audience, I'm going to start this presentation with quite a substantial background. Then I will dive into the research and then end with the emissions component and human dimensions of it. And yes, then looking forward to your questions. As means of background, I want to show these curves that you see ahead of you there. The top one is the global temperature of the planet for 150 years, where you see this global warming that is dominating actually more and more most of the environmental dimensions and everything we measure, in fact, in the environment at this point. Of course, this warming occurs on top of natural variability, which you also see for your eye, but definitely the warming trend, the pace of change of this warming trend is very obvious, is caused by the increasing in greenhouse gases from human activities, and it is set to continue. And this is the main point that this graph makes, is that temperature will stabilize only when the emissions of carbon dioxide in particular, also other long-lived greenhouse gases, are brought down to zero, or net zero if you prefer, if we can't bring the emissions completely down to zero, and we offset them with manipulating or increasing carbon sinks artificially, for example, by planting forests. And this dynamics is actually well known in the carbon cycle. The fact that the temperature would stabilize, they would not revert back, is already obvious that we're not talking about reverting climate change with the action on emissions. We're talking about stabilizing the long-term climate. And the actions that are needed are extremely challenging. Obviously, the more we can bring the emissions down to zero or net zero, the lower the risks, the lower the level of climate change that we set the planet into, and the lower the risks for us. Speaking of risks, we've had some incredible, unbelievable events this summer already, with temperature records. It hit in incredible ways in Canada, and you've seen very sadly this week in Germany and in many places in Europe, very heavy rainfall that are fuel promoted by a warming climate, or made more intense by a warming climate. And when that occurs on very artificial soils like in cities, then it increases the risks of floods. And the temperature extremes and the water extremes are actually the best known properties of climate change, but there's a range of impacts that are associated with climate change. They start with these natural environment, physical environment impacts, and then they sort of penetrate within the climate system through changes in ecosystems, changes in, of course, ice melting, biodiversity, and human activities like water use, food production, and economic impacts. So it seems obvious to me as a climate scientist that the lower the stabilization of climate change is, the lower the risk. I do want to make the point that we've had so far about 1.2 degree warming according to the World Meteorological Organization. And this is an incredible amount of warming already. You have to compare this in terms of planetary term, a little bit like a fever. If you have a fever of 1 degree, if you're 38 degrees Celsius, your body temperature, you're really uncomfortable, you're not well. And it's the same with the Earth. If you have warming of 1 degree, 2 degrees, the Earth properties system functioning, the water cycle, the ecosystems that sustain us, production of food, all this becomes very, very affected by this warming. That's for the introduction for climate, but really my talk is about the bottom line here. So global CO2 emissions and the carbon cycle in general. If we follow emissions according to the Paris Agreement, the trajectory of emissions is upwards, meaning that so far with current policies in place, warming would be about 3 degrees warming. With commitments of policy, we would be possibly closer to 2 degrees Celsius. However, commitments need to be translated into action for that to lower the risk, and I'll come back to this this at the very end. These emissions that we put in the atmosphere, so the today is in the middle here on the yellow line. Oops, sorry, I'm trying to, there we go. This is today. These emissions that we put in the atmosphere themselves perturb the natural carbon cycle. We have carbon everywhere. We're made of carbon. The plants are made of carbon. Soils are made of carbon. There's loads of carbon in the ocean, in the atmosphere. And when we put CO2 in the atmosphere, all of this becomes perturbed. And we know that the carbon cycle, in fact, responds to climate change, responds to changes of CO2 in the atmosphere, because we have evidence from the geological past. If you go very, very far back, 55 million years ago, there was a pulse of carbon in the atmosphere that was possibly caused by methane hydrate releasing or permafrost releasing carbon to the atmosphere suddenly in geological time. So we know there's some feedbacks that can amplify climate change. And we know also from glacial interglacial cycles, from measuring tiny air bubbles that are trapped in ice cores in the pole, in Antarctica in particular, also in the Arctic, that you can measure. You can actually poke these little bubbles and measure CO2, and you see that the carbon cycle actually responds to variability of climate during glaciation. Another point of concern is the fact that to reach net zero emissions, as I mentioned earlier, we need to enhance the carbon sinks. I will talk about the carbon sinks in a minute, but that means actively removing CO2 from the atmosphere. Some of the methods are quite gentle. We know them already. Better agricultural practices to store carbon in soils, planting trees, managing land better, but others are more engineered, and they have more dimension to them. They can compete with land and so on. And so understanding and keeping track of how the carbon storage, the carbon sinks, the natural reservoirs evolve through time is extremely important. Some years ago, in 2004, my colleagues of the Global Carbon Project and myself, we had discussions about what can science do, scientists on the carbon to assist the policy process. So decision makers, the presidents, prime ministers, ministers of the environment, meet every year, twice a year, in fact, to talk about what they're going to do about climate change. The most famous of these meetings has taken place in Paris in 2015, when the Paris Agreement was agreed among the countries at a UN debate. But in fact, politicians meet very often, twice a year. And with my colleagues, we thought, actually, can we do something to support this policy process? And we thought, actually, yes, we can. We can, in fact, provide information about the contemporary carbon cycle. And the contemporary carbon cycle is the storage of carbon in those reservoirs that change on a basis of 1 year to, say, about a century, mostly over a few decades. So let me introduce you to the contemporary carbon cycle. So you have in the atmosphere, I'm going to talk about units of petagrams of carbon here. So this is a scientific unit. It's an amount. So it's 10 to the 15 grams of the molecule carbon in the atmosphere, which is what we had before humans started to deforest massively and to burn fossil fuels. There are other very important reservoirs in this contemporary carbon cycle. One is the ocean. The ocean contains 50 times more carbon than the atmosphere. It is mostly stored in the deep ocean, and the ocean currents move around the whole ocean over time scales of multiple hundreds of years to 1,000 years. So you could say the water mass turns around the ocean, takes roughly, give or take, 1,000 years. And so you have this storage of carbon, which interacts with the atmosphere on those timescales. And you also have carbon stored in the terrestrial biosphere, be it in what we call above ground vegetation, so what you see, trees and grass, and below ground vegetation, which is soils and permafrost. And before we interfered with the atmosphere, we had natural fluxes, which were rather large every year between these reservoirs. The one that you will recognize is the trees that, if you live at the pole, lose their leaves in the autumn, the leaves decay, that CO2 goes back to the atmosphere, and in the spring, the trees grow again, and that draws CO2 down from the atmosphere. So there's a very active natural carbon cycle. And on this, we have since roughly the pre-industrial time, call it 1750, started to emit, so do activities at large scale, initially deforestation, other forms of land management, and then deforestation today and land use today is this middle arrow here. And from about 1950, the emissions of CO2 to the atmosphere started to be dominated by burning fossil fuels. So that is over here, burning fossil fuel, mostly coal for electricity and heat, and mostly petrol for transport. And so these emissions, what we call anthropogenic emissions here, in fact, don't all stay in the atmosphere. More than half every year of the emissions we put in the atmosphere are reabsorbed by the natural carbon reservoir. And about half of this reabsorption, a little bit more, goes in the terrestrial biosphere because plants grow more under a carbon-rich atmosphere. Because they become more efficient at keeping their water. They don't have to open their pores so much to absorb the carbon they need for their tissue. And so that's this arrow here. And the other fraction goes in the ocean. And then what is left in the atmosphere, so this increase, here, 4.7 petagrams of carbon a year on average in the last decade, that's what's causing climate change. And the concentration of CO2, so the stock of CO2 in the atmosphere, the amount of molecules of CO2 that are in the atmosphere has increased by almost 50%. I mean, this is enormous since we started to interfere with the atmosphere on a large scale. Now you can quickly see, I mean, it's kind of almost obvious common sense that those carbon sinks, for one thing, are responses to the change of CO2 in the atmosphere. So if we put more or we put less, there's a response, and that response has dimensions that are related to the nutrient availability on land, the fact that we have forest or not, if we cut them or if they burn, then they're not there to absorb the carbon anymore. In the ocean, the CO2 that is put in the atmosphere and ocean causes ocean acidification. It perturbs the ecosystem and it perturbs the carbon cycle in the ocean. I'll go into this in a bit more detail a bit later. And it also changes the chemistry of the carbon cycle in the ocean. And there are all kinds of feedbacks. Plus, if we start, as we start, because we are now, you can see yourself, I've talked about this already, as we start altering the climate, altering the temperature, the water cycle, then those carbon sinks, which are in the reservoirs, also evolve, also change. And the way they are going to change is, as far as we can tell now, is by releasing, by leaving more of the carbon emitted to the atmosphere in the atmosphere. So the sinks are going to become less efficient to the change in atmospheric CO2 as the level of CO2 goes up and as the level of climate change goes up. This is established by science. We have numbers for the projections. I won't go very much into this today. Perhaps I should say that the current thinking is that the weakening of the carbon sinks and the carbon climate feedback would amplify climate change by between 5 and 30% of warming, and that the known feedback are included in climate change projections as they are provided by the IPCC today. But what my work focuses on is to look at previous decades. So what we have observed of the carbon cycle so far in those 5 components. So 2 emissions, fossil fuel, land use change, and 3 partitioning, atmosphere, land, and ocean. We can reconstruct those with a range of different observations over the past. And what I do is look at what is the consistency in the data. Can we explain the observations as they are today? How much can we explain, and what's left to explore? And that's what I'm going to do to go in now. And this is the latest, this is the most, I think, the most powerful figure of the carbon cycle that has ever been invented. The idea came from Jorge Sarmiento in Princeton University long ago. I was working with him, and he had the idea for this figure, and it was replicated many times. But essentially, at the top here, what you see is the emissions, is what we put in the atmosphere. I mentioned land use change, so deforestation and land use change, starting in 1900, going into 2017 is the latest year here. You see a relatively, I mean, some increase in land use change initially, and then relatively stable, a little bit of an increase in the latest year, but roughly stable, mostly from an increased deforestation in the tropic, and actually abandonment of agriculture at high latitude, which takes up then carbon in that storage. The fossil fuel in around 1950 became the dominant, and you see here increasing rather rapidly with some interesting dynamics that I will go into in a lot more detail later in this presentation. And what you have at the bottom, and this is where the power of the figure lies, is that we have the best estimate that we can say with the Global Carbon Project here of the 3 places where carbon goes in the environment. The atmosphere is the only thing we actually measure there. So this is our best known estimate. Then we have the ocean and the land, which are a combination of models that include processes of the carbon cycle and constrained by some observations, but very heavily based on model processes. So testing the understanding of the carbon cycle. And what comes out of this, or perhaps one last piece of information, is that this black line at the bottom is the reflection of the top panel. So you have the top panel, you reflect it, so that these 5 bits, these 5 shading area here are almost completely independent from one another, so that if we had perfect data and perfect understanding of the carbon cycle, the sum of the 3 reservoirs here would be identical to this black line. And from a scientist, this is where the fun starts. The fact that they are actually not identical, and you can estimate how big is the gap in understanding in the carbon cycle and where does it come from. And one thing that is immediately obvious is that the mean, we have the quantities right. So the sum of the emissions is roughly equal to the sum of the sink. And we have the trends approximately right. So the emissions grow approximately at the same rate as the sinks grow in total, so that we understand the temporal dynamics. But where there remain questions is mostly in the response to climate variability, which is then quantified here on the right-hand side, the carbon budget imbalance, which is the difference between the sum of the sinks and the sum of the emissions here. So that's what you see on the right-hand side. I've only plotted the last 60 years because that's when we have the very reliable atmospheric measurement. And this variability is a puzzle, it is a challenge, and it is the guide to the exploration of the carbon cycle today. I'm by training an oceanographer, physical oceanographer. So I'm going to spend maybe a little bit of time now, perhaps 10 minutes or so, diving into the ocean contribution to this carbon budget imbalance before I go to the emissions part. So let me go into the role of the ocean. The ocean carbon cycle is absolutely fascinating because it is everything at the same time. It is a physical process, so you increase CO2 in the atmosphere, the partial pressure of CO2 increases, and you have just dissolution in the ocean. Then there's a chemical process. Once CO2 is in the ocean, it doesn't stay into CO2 form, its form. It mostly gets converted into bicarbonate. Most of the carbon is bicarbonate. And there's a biological element to it because the surface of the ocean is very active. We have all these organisms, phytoplankton, zooplankton, that get eaten by bigger organisms like whales and penguins, which are less important for the carbon cycle, but they're there, we see them. And so understanding the carbon cycle requires to look at all these scientific dimensions. And really, this is what attracted me to this scientific field before. We have lots of measurements for the surface ocean CO2 measurements, so partial pressure of CO2, which you see on the left-hand side there. There are also lots of gaps. Obviously, in the Southern Ocean, this on the right-hand side is a picture from my colleague Dorothy Baca, who goes in cruises in the Southern Ocean to take those measurements. It's very harsh conditions. There are also people in the audience who do that. This is quite a gentle day in the Southern Ocean summer. It gets much worse in the winter, very strong winds. And yet the Southern Ocean, as you can see from an ocean perspective, is a massive ocean. It affects the uptake of carbon very, very massively. And the way we try to quantify, look at the carbon cycle in the ocean is through measurements and then the use of modern methods like machine learning to extrapolate those measurements to the globe. We also look at measurements of the interior water, like people who go at sea and put instruments down. Now there are automated instruments that do vertical profiles in the oceans, very, very active and growing area of research. And you can use that data to estimate fluxes. And we also look at carbon cycle models, which is what I do, which is building a computer replicate of the ocean marine carbon cycle and letting it evolve under observed atmospheric conditions, and that gives you carbon fluxes. Now, for those of you less familiar with science, the last few slides are going to be a little bit complicated, but I will give you the essence of them. So I want to show here a comparison of different products. So you have the products that are based on actual ocean observations there in orange here. You have the products that are based on ocean models are the purple ones here. and you have the products that are based on interior data, which is the gray and yellow product there. And this is a time series of the ocean carbon sink. So the ocean carbon sink is roughly 2 petagrams of carbon per year, increasing through time. But the bit that is interesting here is how this, this ocean carbon sink has departed from what we expect the ocean sink to be if there is no change in climate at all. There is no change in climate, the ocean sink will only respond to the increasing atmospheric CO2, and the expectation of this is this dashed line over there. But that's not what the estimates suggest. The estimates suggest that in the 1990s, the ocean carbon sink was rather flat, and this is what you see actually here. In the 1990s, the ocean sink was rather flat. And in the 2000, the ocean carbon sink, which is here, was in fact rather rapid compared to the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere. And what we're trying to see is what is the contribution of the ocean to this missing variability, to this atmospheric variability that we measure, which is in blue here. Whatever the ocean doesn't do, either one, we've got it wrong, or two, the land sink has to explain. And so with this work, we have isolated the contribution of the ocean from a wide range of products. And we go one step further, use different, now I'm going to just dig a little bit further and show what comes out of the different methods. So from the 1990s, 3 different types of method, individual products. Overall, if you're far enough away, you see really good consistency across product. And I want to just stress here a little bit, I mean, this is indicative of how climate science works. We cannot completely test hypothesis about the effects of climate change, or indeed about climate change itself, because we can't manipulate the planet. So what we do is we manipulate the replicate of the planet, so our models of climate models, but we also look at the consistency of the evidence with various different methodologies. And here I showed 3 methodologies. They're all consistent. They all show that the ocean carbon sink in the 1990s was a lot weaker than the expectation, which is the dashed line. And they all show, except perhaps the ocean models here, that it was likely bigger than the expectations from increasing atmospheric CO2, so that the climate variability or climate change was acting to reduce the sinks in the 1990s and to increase the sinks in the 2000s. And probably this is related to variability of the winds, particularly in the Southern Ocean, but possibly as well in the tropical Pacific. We can go one step further. Perhaps I would just go really quickly here, using the ocean models to isolate, in fact, quantify the role of CO2 increasing in the atmosphere only versus climate variability, the effect of climate variability and climate change. And you see in the 1990s that it's the opposition between these 2 processes that created this sort of no change in the ocean carbon sink, and that in the 2000 actually the climate variability goes in the same direction and makes the acceleration of the carbon sink in that period. So last slide on this, that the ocean sink can explain about 10 to 40% of the unexplained the carbon cycle imbalance, which I mentioned very early on, meaning that we need also to dig into the insights into the terrestrial biosphere over that period to be able to explain fully the observed changes in atmospheric CO2. Oops, sorry. I want to just spend a few minutes to talk about an emerging dimension of the science of the carbon cycle, which is the role of marine ecosystems. So far, to explain the evolution of the carbon sink as observed and as inferred from a range of data. We haven't had to bring to consider, I guess, changes in marine ecosystems. And the reason for this is the marine ecosystems are mostly dependent on nutrients. They're limited by nutrients. There's plenty of carbon in the ocean, so they're not limited by carbon. And although the uptake of carbon by the ocean causes ocean acidification, so far we've been able to explain the carbon sink in the ocean without inferring any changes in marine ecosystem. But I'm not confident that the future will be the same. In fact, I rather think that with the big changes that are operating, especially ocean acidification and stratification of the ocean from the changes in climate, we are on the cusp of seeing pretty fundamental changes in marine ecosystems. And for this, we have anticipated this, the marine biogeochemists like myself and others, many years ago, possibly as much as actually I fear to say 20 years ago. We started discussions about building models that include marine ecosystems in a more detailed way. This is, maybe I should say just that one of the perks of being an oceanographer is that when you organize meetings, then you can do it in nice coastal ocean areas. So this is exactly what we have been doing for many years now, is to invite ourselves to the Laboratoire d'Océanologie Marine de Villefranche-sur-Mer, so Villefranche-sur-Mer in the south of France, who have welcomed us, a group of scientists, and have gotten together over probably 10 workshops so far to try and discuss what are the important elements of marine ecosystems that we absolutely must include in a carbon cycle model to be able to anticipate those changes in ecosystems that are about to unfold in front of our eyes. This is me here 20 years later, and I'm over here in the first picture. And I want to just say just a little parenthesis here, just to lighten up the seminar a little bit, is that at the very, very early stages of this work, we published, this group who met in Villefranche-sur-Mer in the south of France, we published this publication in the journal Global Change Biology that said that actually if you group the sort of, I don't know, I fear to say how many, but the vast number of marine plankton that are in the ocean into, well, we said 10 at the time, now is 12, into 12 groups of phytoplankton, which we call plankton functional types, PFTs. You can actually reproduce, it's enough. So 10 groups, 12 now, is enough to reproduce the effect of marine ecosystem on the carbon cycle. So we consider 3 criteria. So they needed to have an explicit role, a distinct set of traits, and be quantitative, and 12 is enough. And when we published this, there was 2 publications came out, I mean, really, really rapidly. One that said, one was there, plankton functional type, modeling running before we can walk. How essentially, how dare you do this, not how dare you do this, is way too complicated. We don't have the observations. We are not ready for this. And another publication came with exactly the opposite view and said, then how dare you do this? How dare you represent the complexity of marine ecosystem into 10 boxes? And so you had one on the one side, one on the other side. So I told myself, we must have it approximately right. So we kept going with this. And 10 years on, I mean, it did take us 10 years to produce the first model based on these 10 plankton functional types. And I want to say just a little bit, a few words about what has changed. And it has really allowed us to represent a marine ecosystem in a more satisfying way. I cannot yet say that it's revolutionized, but at least there's a lot more processes. And for this, I'll show you just one map of the surface chlorophyll, which is measured by satellite, observed, where you see in the observations very low levels of chlorophyll in the Southern Ocean. And when we had just very few plankton functional types, so only 4 here, we had very high biomass in the Southern Ocean, which we could control a bit with iron fertilization, which is, of course, a really important element of the Southern Ocean for the experts. But it's really when we introduce a slow-growing top predator, top zooplankton more than predator, krill, because it was slow-growing, it created in the model a trophic dynamics, which allowed us to really reduce the level of phytoplankton in the ocean. And I've made since this composite figure with the observations on the left, the model, plankton model with 10 plankton functional type in the middle with much sharper horizontal gradients of chlorophyll, and the 6 PFT model, so the earlier version, which has a lot more sluggish, the highs are not as high, the lows are not as low, a lot less satisfactory. And so the science of this is really moving fast now, especially with technology of imaging and machine learning. The group in Villefranche-sur-Mer are pioneering seagoing cameras, essentially taking photographs of all the stuff. And with machine learning, you can categorize them into living groups, poops, material, snow, and all kinds of different organisms. And it's really good. Okay, next. For the final part of my talk, except for the last slide, which is an opening, I want to talk about CO2 emissions. The last few years have been quite incredible. So I'm not a satellite specialist myself, but the science of detection of column CO2 in the atmosphere has moved in an incredible way. I mean, as an observer and user of satellite data, I can tell that the last few years with the development of satellite products, the accuracy has become to a level that is now properly incredibly useful. As part of Horizon 2020 European project, I was tasked with evaluating the quality of the information that we can extract from satellite data. So maybe I should say this is an image of the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. So the actual CO2 column inventory, so the stock of CO2, not the emissions, really the stock of CO2. So in the atmosphere, you see all this sort of horizontal variability, and to go from the stock to the emissions. So the stock is really what's in the atmosphere is what you measure. If you either you look at it from satellite or you have these little sort of ground measurement station. So it's the concentration. But what is of interest is the flux, is really what goes in and out of the surface. So if my arms is the surface is just what goes in and out here, and what we measure is what's in the atmosphere there. You need methodology which are inversion. So you get from the concentration. If I measure CO2 here, I measure CO2 there, and the wind is going in that direction here, I know that I've had a carbon sink of 1 in my head. So you can do this with methods over the globe. And as part of this project, I tested the inversions that are using satellite data with the inversions that are not using satellite data, but just atmospheric measurements. And then with the ocean, the terrestrial models, also I did for the ocean, but I won't show that, terrestrial models, which are based on known processes. And the three groups of estimates are there. So the ground observations in purple, satellite observations in blue, and the process models in black. And the first thing that strikes is, well, for these three regions which I picked, the satellite-based products are at least as good as the other products. In some regions, like Australia, the blue, so the satellite-based products are a lot more consistent with the process-based than the ones that is based on surface observations. Probably the network is not dense enough of surface observations, so you have actually real added value from observations. But still, there's an issue that it's difficult when you see this here. And because CO2 stays in the atmosphere for some of it 100 years, some of it goes away within a year, but there are time scales there are different time scales in the ocean carbon sink. And so the average lifetime of CO2 in the atmosphere is 100 years. So when you see the distribution like this, it's really difficult to say what is the emissions from human activities versus what is the very large natural fluxes and the update from the carbon sink. So the way to infer emissions from those measurements is either you take the spatial distribution, and this is what these things are here. So they have taken, the inversions have taken the spatial distribution. So where do you see this? East North America, you know the wind, so you know the origin of the air mass that you're measuring. Or you can do other things. And for the other things, I want to talk about one method that I've been involved with, led by Penelope Pickers at the University of East Anglia. And the method consists of bringing additional information and another element of information. And the one that we're using for this is oxygen. Because as we burn fossil fuels, so the combustion process burns oxygen. So we're actually depleting our atmospheric oxygen content. But the change is very small, so you don't have to worry about breathing or anything. But if you develop extremely sensitive, high-tech measurements of atmospheric CO2, and they are extremely, extremely difficult to make, you can measure this combustion of oxygen in the atmosphere. And this is what I show here. These are measurements from the Weybourne station in North Norfolk, is where I am now, just down the road, 5 kilometers down the road. And so one station in the UK, in the East England, you have, well, the CO2 measurements, which are not so complicated. They're not so easy, of course, but they're quite standard to make here, continuous data. But you see the combustion now. So this blue one where the oxygen is decreasing. And this here is hourly data. So it's incredibly high precision automated measurements. And then there is, for those of you who know terrestrial ecosystem, you'll have picked up straight away that, of course, plants also use oxygen when the photosynthesis use oxygen, sort of emits oxygen as it takes up CO2. But the ratio of oxygen to carbon on plant is very, very constant. Not perfectly constant, but actually very constant. So you can have this variable, which is called atmospheric potential oxygen, APO, which is the combination of the top two measurements, which you see here, this APO, which removes the effect of the biosphere and becomes therefore the effect of the fossil. And then if you can estimate the baseline, so the APO concentration of the background here, so large scale, by using other measurements, by filtering out the weather from this data, which is the black line here, you're left with the fingerprint of fossil emissions in the atmosphere APO. And so, as you can see, we've been doing these measurements for quite a while now, started in 2008. And on this, COVID came and had this very sudden effect on carbon emissions. The lockdown led to big changes in emissions pattern. And as it happens, Norfolk is about 200 kilometers east of London. So the changes that will have taken place in London actually will have appeared in this APO signal. So we tested that with the measurement. This is from a publication led by Penelope Pickers, which was submitted yesterday, in fact, to the journal PNAS. And this APO itself directly, you cannot see the effect of the COVID, at least not so distinctly, because there's not only the effect of emissions, but there's mostly the effect of the weather. So there's weather patterns which change the source, the origin of the air that is being measured. But you can actually correct for this using machine learning method, where you detect or you infer the conditions, the APO conditions, when air originate from different air masses. And therefore, Penelope Pickers has done that. She has applied the machine learning algorithm. She has removed the effect of weather. And what is left here is this red curve here is the fingerprint of fossil emissions in Weybourne down the road from here during COVID 2019. So you see from January to the end, actually this is 2 months ago. So there's just over, I think, 14 months of data here. And you see that during the first wave in the UK, the fingerprint shows systematically a lower fingerprint of emissions in the air just here compared to the previous years, which are the blue lines here. And again, in the second wave. And if you integrate this through time, you do the cumulative, you see this beautiful, beautiful signal emerging of COVID signal. I mean, of course, it was horrible, horrible, but it's still beautiful, beautiful in the measurement, where you have a decrease during the first wave. Between the two waves, things came back up, and then a decrease again, not as strong in the second wave. So this methodology is incredibly powerful, and we're now trying to actually use it to see, well, can we reconstruct the change in emissions that we've seen in the UK in the last decade, almost 30% change, but that will be the subject of another talk. I'm not quite finished though, because there is another method, a third method. I mean, when you have crisis in society, brains start working a lot faster than they would otherwise. And I want here to share a few slides. I'll be a bit over time. I hope that's okay. I want to share a few slides about what happened to me at the beginning of the pandemic last year. So I was doing my thing, my science, whatever I do on a normal day. And on the 27th of February, I got the first call from a journalist who said, we didn't call it a pandemic, but the emerging situation, is it going to have any effect on CO2 emissions? And I'm an expert of the carbon cycle, and I didn't know the answer, so I sent him away. I said, I don't know, go see someone else. And the next day, there was another journalist and another journalist, and quickly I received many, many, many requests every day. And I couldn't face myself. At some point, I called my friends from the Global Carbon Project, and I said, look, you know, we're experts on the carbon cycle, and these are legitimate questions about carbon emissions. The lockdown started there. You see most of China, Italy was under lockdown, US was starting its lockdown. We have to have an answer to that question. Now, before this happened, global emissions were rising slowly, more slowly in the past decade, thanks to climate policy, not the subject of today's talk, but I can back that separately or in the question. We produced emissions data annually based on energy statistics, sometimes monthly data, very, very few daily data. And we were there stuck and we had to produce daily emissions. And we very, very quickly, within weeks, I mean, this very rarely happens in science, within weeks, we develop a new methodology based on new types of data, indirect data. Essentially, what we said is, well, where are the emissions coming from? So power industry, transport, buildings, then small things and aviation at the end. And then we developed a methodology to, well, then before we developed the methodology, we looked at changes in activity in each of these sectors. So we had indirect data of changes in activity. For example, where we have most of the data was in transport, mobility data. Every time you take your app, Google app, you punch in where you want to go. So the change in the user use of mobility data showed that in transport emissions were cut approximately 50% when countries were under full lockdown, approximately 30% for the industry, 15% for power. Then you make a massive back of the envelope calculation and you get to an estimate of the drop in emissions in each of these sectors of the environment. And note that although the aviation was the one that was most touched by the change in activity, they account normally on a normal year for only 3% of global emissions. So their absolute change is not dominant. The absolute change was mostly from transport. So with this methodology, we were able to bring a trajectory for emissions showing that they decreased just here, there, 17% in the early April, back up afterwards, a lot more at the country level, approaching 30% when countries were under full lockdown. But of course, not everybody was under full lockdown at the same time, and provide an estimate, which for the latest estimate is about a drop in 6% in the emissions for 2020, which you see over here. We expect a rebound this year so that this decrease in emissions will not last because it is not caused by structural changes. We still have the same cars in our garages. For those of us who have one, we just used it during the confinement to change the emission, decrease the emissions. We need investments in different kind of infrastructure. And the investment in the post-pandemic is really where the critical bits are in terms of getting us out of emissions. I want to say that this experience of the pandemic has really shown to me, but to my colleagues and many people, that timely scientific analysis makes a huge difference, because we were able in the middle of the pandemic to say, this is how big the emissions drop is. It's not going to last, but the investment in the post-pandemic recovery plan will make a huge difference in tackling climate change. So if you are a scientist in the room, I would invite you to use your voice at critical moments like we're doing now for the climate change, the impact of climate change on extreme flood. This is a completely different topics on sciencebrief.org, but I do want to mention that the interface between science and public policy is one that definitely needs a lot more voice from the scientific community, and it makes science better. I will stop here. Thank you very much, and apologies for going a little bit over time.
Thank you very much, Corinne, for this very interesting presentation. And we have time for a few questions. So for the participants, you can either write a question in the chat, or you can raise your hand if you want also. and then we will give you the floor. But I see already two, maybe more. A few questions in the chat. So Corinne, you prefer I read the question and you answer. Okay, the first one from Andreas Groh is what caused the clear peak in the land use change at the end of the 90s?
Yeah, thanks for your question. So the way that deforestation happens is the landowners use the climatic conditions, favorable climatic conditions, to burn vegetation because it's easier to deforest in this way. So when it's very dry, then that's when there's more deforestation. So you have an amplification of climate variability from a very human dimension. And in the end of the 1990s, there was a big El Nino, so it was very dry, and there was a lot of peatland deforestation, particularly in the tropics, Southeast Asia, and that's what caused the peak. I should say that there possibly were other peaks before the late 1990s, but we didn't have satellite data, which started to be incorporated in the land use change at approximately that time.
Thank you. The next question is by Hans Zinecker. So the question is, I recently heard on TV that the Amazon forest emits three times more CO2 than it absorbs. Is it true, and why?
So it's a very, very active area of research, the Amazon forest, and there was actually indeed the latest publication there about, it's really about the comparison between how much deforestation there is and how much reabsorption there is. So I can't confirm exactly those numbers, but I can confirm that over the entire tropics, these two numbers are about in balance. So there's as much deforestation over the whole tropics than there is absorption in the whole tropics, although there's a lot of variability in those numbers as well. And we know now a lot more about the way that the management, so not full deforestation, but also managements makes the vigorosity, I guess, no, the strength of the carbon sink weakens the strength of the carbon sink, so that the carbon sink weakens not only when there's full deforestation, but when there is managed forest. And this study that you referred to had more information about, building roads through forest and a bit of management. And according to their estimate, then the balance was tipping the other way. So very active area of research to keep an eye on. It's actually very serious what is happening in the Amazon, and it's really important, one, to monitor it, but also to try and constrain, manage, reduce deforestation, reduce the pressure. I want to balance this by saying that it's also important in the UK, where I live, where it's only 10% forested, to actually forest the regions where we can and where it makes sense.
Thank you. Next question by William Wall. Can we use this CO2 monitoring to find those who have anomalously large carbon emission, thereby allowing us to pressure them to reduce their emission?
Yeah, I mean, there's two dimensions to your question. One, we already know where the large emitters are. So there's already quite a lot of pressure being put on these emitters. If we can use, did you say satellite observation, CO2 monitoring? We can certainly use monitoring in the largest possible way. This is really exactly at the frontiers of science here, because what we can do with science now is mostly as good as what you can infer from energy statistics. So you can confirm the emissions reported by energy statistics. If you have very dense network of surface observations, you can now go one step further, which is look at the state or the city level. There's a lot of work done in the UK I'm familiar with, but also in California, I'm sure elsewhere as well. It's not yet the case where you can use the satellite data and provide a grid of the human emissions, because there's too much interference from land use. But I have seen early results from inferring, for example, the COVID signal, which were really, really promising. And I'm confident that with another few years, possibly a decade of remote sensing will be there.
Okay, so the next two questions are about uncertainties. So there is one question: do you have any comments of the uncertainty on modeling CO2 fluxes? And the other question by Burrows, John Burrows, is what is the error in your estimate of reduction of CO2?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, we have quite a lot of information on the uncertainty, but it's not your standard statistical uncertainty like you would expect. For the emissions, the uncertainty, the most quantitative source of uncertainty, the biggest bit of uncertainty comes from the combustion factors. So when you burn coal, how much CO2 is emitted depends on the type of coal, the conditions, how you do your burning. And so these emissions factors are the biggest source of uncertainty. We know what the uncertainties are on the emissions factors, and you can propagate that. And in the Global Carbon Budget annual update, you can find this in the journal Earth System Science Data, and the uncertainty and methodology is fully documented there. For the uncertainty in the carbon sinks, it's a lot. We have a quantification of the uncertainty, but it's not super satisfactory. For the land sink, we use a model ensemble. So we have 15 different land models, and we use the standard deviation of this. In the ocean, we also use a model ensemble, but in the ocean, it is verified by independent products based on observation. So you can say that the uncertainty is quite large. I would say plus or minus 25% in the ocean, and plus or minus probably more like not quite 50% on land, but approaching that. But the confidence is better and better because we have different products.
We have many more questions, Corinne. So if you can have quick answers.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm sorry. But the next question is, you said we are expecting major change on from marine ecosystems, and can you comment about that?
Yeah, marine ecosystems are under multiple stress: climate change, ocean acidification, plastics, changes in fisheries, we can expect, I think, changes in the way they operate, especially how much carbon goes into the deep ocean. I cannot really say the direction of the change at the moment. Instinctively, because climate warming will cause stratification, which has big implications for nutrients and regeneration. More regeneration of ecosystems would reduce the export of carbon to the deep ocean and decrease the capacity of the ocean of taking CO2. That's my anticipation, and also from current very, very early model estimates.
Okay, so the next question is by Craig Dolan. It's about CO2 fluxes over the ocean, and you mentioned the SOCAT data. And the question is, what is required in the future
to improve the flux of the ocean? The most useful would be a lot more data, because I think that the machine learning methodology are there now. They've proven their worth. They're particularly good where there is data. It's when there are gaps in data where it's really problematic. You need real surface ocean data, and you need either ships of opportunity or actual cruises to go and measure.
Okay, next question is about see methane emission. So can you comment on the importance of methane emission and its potential for reduction, temperature increase? I think it's not a reduction, it's an increase, but can you comment on that?
Yeah, so methane emissions are important. They're caused by livestock, so burps of animal, cows in particular. And they're also caused by fossil emissions to some extent. And there's natural methane emissions from permafrost and wetlands. And at the moment, there's no evidence of large-scale change or outgas of emissions from the natural stocks, although there's a lot of evidence of their variability to climate. And therefore, if we are able to reduce the emissions from livestock by reducing the stock of animals, then we could help to reduce climate change in the short term. Because methane is a short-lived greenhouse gas, you actually have a one-off decrease in emission of a few tenths of a degree with the current emissions of methane and the potential. To stabilize climate in the long term, you need to tackle the long-lived greenhouse gas, that's CO2 and nitrous oxide.
Okay, the next question is about the carbon budget slide you showed. And the question is why the model shows some short-term variability.
Yeah, that's mostly the land models. They're very variable. So the terrestrial ecosystem respond very, very much to climate variability for rainfall and of temperature in the tropics. So if you have typically an El Nino conditions with wet and hot conditions, then you have less uptake, and the reverse when you have a La Nina condition, and that has a really big signature in the atmosphere. In fact, you see the El Nino in the atmospheric, in the carbon fluxes, and that's the reason.
The next question is about volcano CO2 emissions, modern emission from volcanoes, and why do they contribute little to the total emission compared to the past? For example,
yeah, they are very small.
mentioned the mass extinctions event in geological times. So can you comment on that?
So yeah, the volcanic emissions, they're very small. They're about 100 of the emissions from fossil fuel, and so you would need to accumulate them over a long time. So that's why they had an effect geologically and not today, because the time scale are really completely different. Volcanic emissions affect climate. So a few years after major volcanic emissions like the Pinatubo, you typically have a bit of a cooling, a little bit of a cooling of the climate, but otherwise you can actually ignore them because they're small on an annual time scale.
The next question is about the role of the deep ocean in the carbon sink, and if there is a change in the deep ocean circulation, what would be the impact on the carbon sink?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the really big questions. If you have it depends a lot on what time scale it happens. You have two opposite effects. If you slow down the overturning circulation, you take anthropogenic carbon, but you also bring more deep ocean carbon-rich water. So in the Southern Ocean, where the winds have increased, this is what we think is happening. So you have more overturning, you bring carbon-rich water, and you weaken your carbon sink, at least for a period of 20 years up to 2004. So in recent years, it's less clear. In other basins, there is this compensating effect. So this is a big area of research. I don't want to speak with confidence here about what the implications would be.
Okay, next question is about the reduction in CO2 emission by air travel. So the question is, why is it so low given the relatively large decrease in activity? And by the way, I had a similar question.
Yeah.
Because we are always criticizing traveling by plane, but as you showed, the strongest emission comes from surface transport and a reduction in emission, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. So emissions of CO2 from air transport today are about 3% of global emissions. So even if you turn them off completely during the COVID pandemic, the most you could do is 3% of global emissions. And therefore, it's lower than for surface transport. Surface transport is 20% of global emissions. If you cut that in two, it's a big number. Air travel, just a parenthesis on air travel here, is really a big issue. The fact that it didn't contribute that much to the drop in emissions, although it did contribute a lot, just maybe not the dominant, it should not erase the fact that it's really a big issue, because we don't have an alternative fuel for air travel. The jet fuel is very expensive. To produce it at the large scale to fuel air travel is actually not really thinkable today, although the industry makes a lot of noise about it. It's also a sector that evolves very slowly because the planes stay a long time. And so when all the other sectors are zero emissions, which they will be in 30 years in Europe, at least, where we have that commitment, then you're stuck with air travel. And air travel becomes actually the reason why you need enhanced carbon sinks, because you cannot bring them to zero. So it is a real problem that we have to control. It's actually the only sector where it's almost unthinkable to reach net zero emissions without having some form of a control on the demand, at least controlling the growth, and if not even the demand.
So that we stop here, and if the participants want to ask you more questions, they can send you an email. So the next question is about what is the first step in reverting global warming in your opinion?
Yeah, cutting emissions is absolutely the most important, is where we have the biggest leverage. Emissions come from coal in many places, and transport are the two big. In Europe would be the two big ones. That's where we have the biggest leverage. That we have solutions. The costs are not that expensive; they're affordable. Really, the effect that you can have in cutting emissions are powerful, and they will have effects straight away in at least the rate of warming.
The next question, and I suggest the last question, unfortunately, is about the seasonal variability of CO2 emission. So the question is, I read the question. Corinne, you showed the CO2 distribution of the entire world. Sorry. In summer, the CO2 reduced because of photosynthesis. However, in winter, it increased again. Is it the new additional emission you see? I understand in summer, in winter.
Yeah. So in winter, it comes up through the decay of the leaves plus the emissions. So if you search for Mauna Loa on the web and look at images, you will see a curve that goes up with seasonal wiggles. So the small seasonal wiggles is the biosphere, and the trend is the emissions.
Okay, so I think we have no additional questions. So Corinne, on behalf of all participants, we warmly thank you for this very interesting and timely presentation. So thank you again, and see you next time.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye to everybody.